The Beautiful Ones, written and narrated by Peter J. Merrick. A month ago, back in May, I sat inside a Tim Hortons near Bathurst and Finch in Toronto, having one of the strangest conversations of my life with a 26-year-old Gen Z kid named Michael O., who I have mentored for years, somewhere between black coffee, a Boston cream donut, and my slowly collapsing confidence in modern dating. He proceeded to completely dismantle my romantic worldview using something he proudly called the Michael O Index. Michael explained modern relationships to me the way an investment banker explains why your retirement portfolio just evaporated during a market crash. I sat there listening to him calmly calculate the financial inefficiency of my idea of taking a beautiful woman out for a romantic weekend, while I nearly choked to death on pastry cream, realizing my generation may have accidentally raised young men who now emotionally hedge intimacy the same way institutions hedge currency risk. The strange part about the entire conversation was that Michael was not angry, hateful, or even cynical in the traditional sense. He genuinely believed he was educating me and protecting me from making emotionally reckless decisions in what he sees as a brutal dating environment where many young men increasingly feel that vulnerability itself has become financially and psychologically dangerous. Now here I was a month later back in San Diego, walking beside the Pacific Ocean, reflecting on that conversation over and over again. Toronto and San Diego honestly feel like two entirely different emotional realities, because Toronto feels like a city designed by exhausted accountants, while San Diego feels like somebody took vitamin D and optimism and somehow turned it into municipal zoning policy. I walked beside the water holding a black coffee while groups of impossibly healthy-looking individuals jogged past me with the relaxed confidence of people who definitely remember to stretch before exercising. Meanwhile, I was walking carefully down a slight incline near the beach, trying not to injure myself while reflecting on the collapse of Western civilization and wondering when exactly middle age becomes a full-time negotiation between your soul and your lower back. As I walked along the coastline, I realized I could not stop thinking about something much deeper underneath all the humor from my conversation with Michael O. What bothered me was not his dating formulas themselves. What bothered me was realizing that Michael's worldview is no longer unusual and that tens of millions of young men quietly think exactly like him now. Many of these young men are not monsters, and most are not hateful toward women. They are emotionally exhausted individuals who grew up inside algorithmic dating culture, economic instability, pornography, social media, collapsing trust in institutions, rising loneliness, isolation, in a world increasingly rewarding performance over authenticity. As I walked beside the Pacific, I started thinking about how many men I personally know who have quietly separated themselves from society over the last decade. Some disappeared into work, some disappeared into gaming, some disappeared into endless gym routines, some disappeared into politics, substances, pornography, or complete emotional withdrawal while pretending everything was perfectly fine because modern men increasingly hide pain behind humor, productivity, sarcasm, and motivational Instagram captions. Many still function normally on the surface. They answer emails, go to work, pay taxes, post vacation photos, and smile in public, while internally feeling disconnected from almost everything around them. I understand this more than I'd like admitting, because there were periods in my own life where I also separated myself from the pack of humanity for long stretches of time. After divorce, public conflict, professional stress, years of emotional exhaustion, and watching institutions I once respected increasingly feel hollow and performative, parts of me quietly withdrew too. I did not fully disappear, but I absolutely became more guarded, more isolated, and far more selective about who had access to my energy. Because Eventually, a man realizes that constantly bleeding emotionally in public eventually leaves him spiritually exhausted. And that thought triggered a memory about one of the most disturbing experiments I had ever read about, called the Universe 25. If you have never heard of it before, I promise you, once you understand it, parts of modern society suddenly become difficult to unsee. Back in 1968, a scientist named Dr. John Calhoun created what was essentially a perfect utopia for mice. He gave them unlimited food, unlimited water, perfect climate conditions, abundant housing, safety from predators, every physical resource they would ever need to survive and thrive. At first, the experiment looked incredibly successful. The mice reproduced rapidly, the population expanded, and the tiny mouse civilization appeared healthy and stable. If modern governments had overseen the project, they probably would have announced record mouse GDP growth while introducing a federally subsidized rodent sustainability initiative. But something strange slowly started happening. The mice began psychologically changing, even though resources remained unlimited, and survival itself was no longer difficult. Some became hyper-aggressive, while others became withdrawn and isolated. Mothers stopped caring for offspring. Social bonds weakened. Violence increased. And eventually, Calhoun identified a subgroup of male mice he famously called the beautiful ones. The beautiful ones completely withdrew from meaningful participation in mouse society. They stopped mating, stopped competing, stopped protecting territory, stopped socially engaging, and spent almost all their time grooming themselves while looking physically perfect on the outside. Calhoun described it as a kind of spiritual death occurring before physical death. The mice remained biologically alive, but psychologically disconnected from meaning, purpose, connection, and healthy social participation itself. Standing there beside the Pacific Ocean, I could not stop thinking about how much modern society increasingly resembles aspects of Universe 25. We now live in the most materially abundant civilization in human history, and yet loneliness, anxiety, depression, social withdrawal, disengagement, and emotional exhaustion continue rising almost everywhere. We carry supercomputers in our pockets, yet millions of individuals have never felt more disconnected from each other. We have unlimited entertainment, unlimited distraction, unlimited pornography, unlimited streaming, unlimited social media validation loops, and unlimited noise, while simultaneously experiencing collapsing birth rates, rising loneliness, declining trust, and emotional fragmentation. One of the things that struck me hardest while reflecting on Universe 25 again was how much of modern life now revolves around forms of digital grooming behavior. The beautiful ones obsessively groomed themselves because they no longer meaningfully participated in society, and modern individuals increasingly curate online identities, monitor engagement metrics, endlessly scroll, optimize appearance, filter photographs, and present emotionally polished versions of themselves while privately feeling exhausted and disconnected. Please understand, I'm not writing this from some morally superior position, because I participate in this too. The irony is that while I was reflecting on all of this, I caught myself writing this exact article instead of working on my manuscript, Killing Crypto, the sequel to our international bestseller, It Starts With Gold, which I co-wrote with Adrian C. Spitters. There I was, walking beside the Pacific Ocean, contemplating the collapse of modern civilization while simultaneously procrastinating on my actual responsibilities by philosophically overanalyzing society like a middle-aged anthropologist with lower back pain and too much caffeine in his bloodstream. Self-awareness does not automatically cure irrational behavior. Sometimes it just makes your dysfunction more articulate. As I continued walking, I came across another discussion online about why millions of individuals are increasingly choosing isolation over participation in modern society. What struck me was not the bitterness in the discussion. What struck me was the exhaustion underneath it. Many individuals describe feeling overwhelmed by the sheer noise of modern life, constant notifications, endless expectations, performative culture, emotional exhaustion, social comparison, shallow interactions, and the growing sense that modern society increasingly extracts energy from individuals without restoring anything meaningful in return. One of the most interesting realizations I had while reflecting on all of this came from my own observations throughout life about the way wounded dogs often isolate themselves from the pack when vulnerable. Instinctively, they seek safety, quiet, healing, and protection away from exposure because something deep inside them understands vulnerability changes how the world responds to them. Oddly enough, that resonated with me deeply because I have seen versions of that behavior in my own life and in many men I know. When men feel deeply wounded, betrayed, humiliated, exhausted, or emotionally overwhelmed, many instinctively retreat into silence, not because they are weak, but because something ancient inside them seeks protection, recovery, reflection, and distance from further emotional injury. Modern culture often treats male isolation as automatic dysfunction or pathology. Sometimes it absolutely can become unhealthy, destructive, or permanent. But I also think there are periods where solitude becomes a kind of psychological recovery room, where a man reconnects with himself after years of performing versions of himself designed to satisfy everybody else. I think many men eventually reach a point where the agreeable version of themselves quietly dies. The version constantly trying to please everyone, avoid conflict, absorb disrespect, suppress emotion, maintain appearances, and endlessly perform usefulness in exchange for approval eventually becomes psychologically unsustainable. Isolation can become dangerous if a man permanently disappears into it. But sometimes solitude allows him to hear himself think clearly again without constant noise, pressure, distraction, judgment, expectations, or emotional manipulation. Sometimes the false version of himself dies there, and something healthier slowly reemerges in its place. I think that is partly why the Universe 25 experiment haunts me so much. The beautiful ones did not physically die first. Something psychological and spiritual died inside them long before the body followed. When individuals lose meaning, healthy connection, trust, belonging, purpose, challenge, and authentic participation in life, they often slowly begin withdrawing emotionally from the world around them. Some become hyper-aggressive, others become numb, others disappear into endless self-grooming, optimization, distraction, and emotional detachment while privately feeling empty. Despite all of this, I still fundamentally disagree with complete nihilism. I still believe there is something sacred about authentic human connection, even when it involves risk, inefficiency, vulnerability, disappointment, and heartbreak. At 57 years old, I still believe in bookstores, handwritten notes, meaningful conversation, accidental connection, laughter, forgiveness, emotional intimacy, and relationships where two individuals finally stop performing and simply become real together. According to Michael O., this probably means I have the survival instinct of a golden retriever wandering into freeway traffic, carrying flowers and emotional optimism. Still, I cannot fully surrender my humanity to optimization culture. I would rather occasionally get hurt remaining emotionally alive than become psychologically numb while perfectly curating my existence into a spiritually sterile life built entirely around self-protection. I think many individuals today secretly hunger for authenticity more than perfection. They want genuine connection, emotional safety, meaningful conversation, community, peace, laughter, trust, and relationships where they no longer feel pressured to constantly perform versions of themselves for social survival. The mice in Universe 25 did not die because they lacked resources. They died because abundance alone could not provide meaning, healthy social structures, emotional connection, or purpose. Human beings are obviously far more complex than mice, and these are simply my own reflections while walking the San Diego coastline thinking about modern life. Still, the parallels between rising loneliness, collapsing birth rates, emotional withdrawal, quiet quitting, social fragmentation, and the beautiful ones are difficult for me to ignore. Maybe the answer is not becoming colder, more detached, or more transactional. Maybe the answer is becoming more conscious, more discerning, more emotionally honest, and more intentional about who and what we allow access to our lives. Maybe healthy solitude has value when used wisely. Maybe silence sometimes allows us to rediscover parts of ourselves buried beneath years of noise, performance, distraction, fear, and emotional exhaustion. But I also believe human beings are ultimately wired for meaningful connection, and that permanent isolation eventually becomes its own kind of prison. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe I am simply an aging Gen Xer walking beside the Pacific Ocean, overthinking civilization while carrying overpriced coffee and procrastinating on his manuscript. But I still believe there is profound value in remaining fully human in a culture increasingly rewarding emotional withdrawal. I still believe love, friendship, vulnerability, laughter, purpose, and authentic connection matter even when they cannot be efficiently quantified, optimized, or reduced to formulas scribbled onto stained Tim Hortons napkins. And perhaps the fact that so many of us still instinctively feel that truth deep inside ourselves means we are not fully lost. Yet, Peter J. Merrick, A.K.A. Old Fart, still optimistic for humanity.